Kia ora tatou. Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to talk a little bit about wilding conifers in New Zealand, which many of you will have heard, and there's been quite an effort over the years. So what I'll try to do today is give you an overview about wilding conifers and some of the insights for biosecurity. Heaps of people over the years worked on this, and so I'll try not to misrepresent them over the next 20 minutes or so. So I'll start with some of the take-home messages, just to superficially skim over this big thing, is wildings are considered one of New Zealand's worst weeds. No question by any measure they are. However, there's been an amazing amount of management and research on them, and in some ways that's international leadership in this area around biosecurity. There's been an integration. We might hear more about the wallabies as another approach to this. There's predator-free. It's how do we work together in partnership or collectively to do things better? And so wildings has really been a kind of a case study. How does this partnership model really work? And the last thing is really, how do you sustain the effort? This is an ongoing thing with lots of different biosecurity. You get a start. What do you do with the fickleness of funding and so forth? So we'll back up a step. New Zealand, we'll all be aware in the room, is an incredibly invaded place. I bill myself as an ecosystem ecologist. I never worked on invasions before coming to New Zealand. Spent a lot of time planting pine trees in northern Canada. But if we had a laser pointer, those points up in the top right are New Zealand. So by global standards, we're highly invaded along with Hawaii. So it's a peculiar place in terms of the number of weed species. This figure, don't worry about the details, we can share it, talks about the services we get from non-native tree species. It's a global review, and what it says is New Zealand's dependence on non-native trees for a whole lot of services is off the scale. We're with Chile and a couple of southern hemispheres because we don't have indigenous forestry. We rely on them for food, shelter, timber, and so forth. So a lot of those are pines. And a lot of these are legacy. They've been around for a while. It's not a recent exercise. I mean, there's been serious efforts at introduction. This is a St. James homestead, multiple species around there. For those who have been up to St. James, I mean, these are valued in places for shelter and so forth. So there's negotiations. What do they do? The problem is they don't stay put. They don't stay planted. And so often there's a bit of an issue. Many of you will have seen these. You probably spent some effort managing them, I'm imagining. So how have they become invasive? Of course, it's linked back to that planting effort, that introduction effort, the dependence on non-native species. This is work by Phil Hume and others. It really shows we can look at things like climate suitability. Well, that's really high, no question, because things were brought in deliberately from climate-matched areas. But it's actually all about propagal pressure. It's not the biology of the species. It's all about bringing them in for a deliberate purpose. That's the reason that they're invasive. So it's a bit of an oops. If you could look back and rewind the tape, would you do a different risk assessment? Probably, but that's just a bit of background. Everybody will probably be well aware of the invasion curve. Don't worry about all the details here, but basically what it says is for wildings, we're well up that curve. There's publications, Clayson Howell put up the curve. Some idea of the scale of it is best estimate is 3 million hectares have wilding conifers on them in New Zealand and have been managed at least once. What this figure actually shows, though, is it's not the biological invasion that the curve, it's also the awareness of the issue, and the awareness comes late in the piece. So by the time we respond and do things, we're not being proactive, we're being reactive. That's costly. It doesn't actually slow invasions. That's not a conifer issue. That's very generic. But we can put some values on the benefits and cost. For the wildings, it's, depends on which time scale you look at, but it's 30, 40 or more to 1. So for business cases, it looks pretty good at getting in early and doing the management. There's Clayson's invasion curve, just to put a little fear in us. The fear is if we didn't do any management, what would it look like? 7 million hectares plus of invaded area. So that was the big stick to go to Treasury to get funding for the management. It also prompted a national strategy. This is where the partnership came in. There's no one agency, no one group of landowners that could tackle such a big problem. It had to be a partnership. Nothing beats having a national strategy to point to say, here's what we're going to do. Stop and contain wildings by 2030. You might think that's aspirational and impossible, but at least it's a national goal you could point to and say it's actually worth putting the time and effort into getting that right. So that's a crucial piece of the puzzle. a lot of what I'll talk about the science isn't the details. It's actually big MB programs. These are the 5-year big collaborations. We led one called Winning Against Wildlings that ran to 2021. We currently have a second one on reinvasion. So if you do your management, what happens to the second and third waves of invaders? And as we'll see in a minute, that's unfortunately going to be happening quite a lot in the next few years. So some of the science, just very superficially, is one of the things is, well, how risky are wildlings? Whether they're a planted source or already out and invading, what's risky about them? So this is really largely work Sarah Wise did postdocing at Lincoln, looking at all the different factors about what makes conifers risky from, are they palatable to grazers? Is it about downwind plantings and they're resilient to being invaded and so forth? And basically the evidence is, sure, sighting things in the vegetation really does make a big difference. Grazing, don't rely on it to control, but she has data to underpin the risk calculator. And so some of these things are in law now. It's a busy slide. Don't worry, the details. A lot of my own work is on what are happening in soils. That's especially collaborating with Ian Dickey on Mr. Mycorrhizae. And, you know, what are the diversity effects? Part of the reason for doing the management isn't to get rid of the conifers, it's to protect diversity in places. So we could put data to say, yep, there are diversity declines. Early in invasion, though, you can actually have a bump up in diversity. So a little bit of invasion can actually be good. There's thresholds in with the management. So if you have up to a 20% cover, that's sparse, that's one strategy. Then it kind of goes to what happens when you get 50, 60% cover, that's a tricky zone, and then you go to boom spraying. So a lot of the diversity information is also linked through to how the management of these can occur. Heaps of pubs. Anybody wants to know more, sing out or at the break. A few of the things, though, just a headline is there's things like we did underestimate risk historically. There weren't really good data, or some of what we had tended to underestimate how far some of the conifers went. We can skip down. I mentioned soils only briefly because actually this is important for the reinvasions. There's huge changes in nutrient cycling. With plantations or wildlings, you get big bump ups in phosphorus, and that keeps on going for at least a decade longer. So it actually means you've changed the system. You've changed the nutrient status, which is great for some options for what comes next. We'll talk about that in a minute, but not great if you want native woody veg, especially. So that's what I call fundamentally altering ecosystems. Once the invasion's happened, it's very difficult to reverse. So what does control look like? Many of you will have seen these. Maybe you've been involved with wildling control. There's all sorts. There's no one management technique works. Depends on the density, the site, and the species. So there's ground control, there's cutting, there's herbicides, there's drill and fill. A lot of the research goes into the good practice guides on these things about how does the management do a good job. It's about health and safety. So we work closely with especially DOC and MPI on a lot of that. There's also been quite a lot of work on the management itself. It's not about the ecology or the causes of the invasion. It's how do we do a better job of management? And again, heaps of work going on to things like, can we automate mapping of conifers? Where are they in the landscape to plan operations using drones or fixed wings and remote sensing? There's some sort of crazy ideas about, could we get drones that can measure the size of a tree and give you a dose specifically for bigger trees, get more herbicide? Those sort of things are being trialed, and some of those are well down the track of commercialization. So there's actually quite a lot of work on translating the research through to sort of better management tools. Some of the country is very difficult to work in, as many of you probably appreciate. So things like drones, where you can get rid of helicopter and some of the risk associated with that, are seen as quite a good thing. One I do want to mention is there's some higher tech things like sterile Douglas fir. How do you prevent the problem in the first place? Some of those hit a regulatory barrier. So there is sterile, we think, fir. This is by Scion researchers, where they gene edited sterile Douglas fir. But you can't field trial to make sure that they're sterile. So the regulations won't let you field trial, but you can't test whether they're sterile without doing them in the field. You can't test that in the lab. And so do you go to Australia? What do you do? Currently, it's on ice. Maybe the last thing to say from the research is the importance of people in this throughout. So in terms of what this map on the left shows is a sort of variation in people's awareness. Where there's wildings, very high, 75% plus awareness of wildings, but you can go to other places where it's not really an issue, it's not seen as a priority. But these things matter in terms of the support for the management and the effectiveness of being able to get access to places and so forth. So the social components of the wildings are huge. There's certainly bits around what do we want long term, and that's really what I'll spend the next little bit of time on. So there's lots of questions that come up in the research, some of that driven by managers and practitioners on the ground. So what are they having? Their impacts? We mentioned diversity. Is our management working? How do we know? Can we map it? Are we making progress towards those national goals we talked about? What are the benefits? Because this is when we're going to ask for more resource that we need to show benefits as well. Don't worry about the graphic. This is messy. This is what a partnership looks like. It's complicated. You've got a lot of central government, you've got a national team, and science is a little advisory group and throughout. But what it means is at least that's the evidence for making the case for more funding. And that certainly has been 3 rounds of investment cases for wildings. And then there's probably more to come. So it's worked. If you want details, there's other people we can point to, but it's an amazing partnership, really. So what's next? Loaded question, because there's a couple of answers to this. What's next in terms of on the ground? What's next in terms of the management and the science? So for those who probably have read the Weeds report Simon Upton of the PC did, amazing, thick piece of work in there. Wildings were certainly highlighted as a major issue. The map on the right is the management units and what's been done nationally. That's what 2 million hectares of management at least once off looks like. So in the last 10 years, or since 2016 at least, there's been 2 million hectares where there's been at least one management effort on wildings. It's been huge. It's the sort of stuff that Simon Upton really did highlight in the report. But one of the questions was, well, what do we hope to achieve by doing that scale of management? The costs, as well as a lot of you will know, these lines are looking at for different organizations. What happens if you look at the budget with wildings, which are the high lines, or the money spent on other things, which is the dashed lines? And so the difference tells you just how big wildings have been. Currently 33 million a year is spent on wildings. It goes down to 10 next year. So what's next is a drop in funding. There's no missing that. That drop or that cliff, like lots in central government, is jobs for nature. It's been a huge boost for wildings. It was the latest one was all about employment. It was literally hundreds of jobs for contractors. That comes to an end next year. So that's what the drop is, or what comes next is how do we keep people employed, but also where is management unlikely to happen? Not an easy place to be in, but it was on the back of that drop from jobs for nature. So a kind of a schematic, just to take a helicopter view of what's next, is if we've got on the left on invaded, we can have a system where invasions are happening, and the lines off to the right are the removal. That's really a simple way of thinking. The management is basically killing trees or removing them. But what comes next depends on what's been there in the first place, so we can get a reinvasion, which I've mentioned a few times. There is no one-off getting rid of wildings. You certainly get second, third, and more waves, and the status quo management is to try to revisit before the next wave seeds. So that certainly is an issue. But there are other things like, would you actually want to push it towards a pasture? We'll talk more about this just to wrap up. Do you get other invasions? And of course you do. We get the broom and the gorse that Paul talked about. We get exotic grasses and so forth. Some of the data we have says you don't get back what you had in the first place. You go to something different. You certainly do not get your native woodies back. So you get something different. Is that preferable? That's a judgment call on the landowner. And there is a lot of work now. We're coming on, well, what does a transition look like? What do we actually want for that land post the management? So what follows? There's a couple of options. Ian Dickey and a group of us pulled together all the science we could to get on this about what comes next and try to put it into a usable form, if you like. So what comes next are basically, we can try to maintain tussock grasslands, and that is the most difficult thing. You really are trying to stop or contain and diligence. So it's a huge effort. Once you start, you want to keep going. But the other options are improved pasture. I'll just talk about these briefly. Replanting to less spreading types of trees, which isn't done, but that's an option, or trying to get natural succession or some sort of active restoration through to native woodies. The thing about these ecosystem changes I mentioned earlier is that changes the options you have or how much work it takes to get what's next. So pasture, many people have probably been up to Flock Hill, looked across. It's been one of those active testing grounds. It's unmissable. It's had management and fires and grazing and you name it. But actually those flats now are cut and carry lucerne. They're the sort of thing where you can consider a pasture to prevent the invasion, but the objective is to have economic activity from grazing. It's about getting your stock units up. And there are techniques where you basically need to do multiple things, seed, fertilize, fence, and so forth. But that is one option. What we haven't worked out is how much grazing is enough to prevent invasion, but it's certainly being done in places. So there are good examples to look at. Lower risk non-native species aren't really considered very much. There are certainly alternatives for things like shelter belts, get rid of this risky thing, plant this safer or less risky species, but this isn't being done at scale. And some of the things that are sold, I just put these highlights, there's certainly lots of interest in, well, what are we planting and is it going to spread? This sort of stuff is certainly coming up in carbon farming. That's been ramping up in recent years and probably set to stay because the intention there is not to harvest. And so that may or may not be an opportunity for beyond carbon. What else are you going to get? The other one isn't about wildings, but certainly from plantations, there's a set of interest in, well, how do we not replant back in the same species? This is happening in a number of places, but we might have some more active restoration where we underplant or look at other weed management to facilitate natives. So this is people like Adam Forbes, a lot of you may know, been working on this. The thing is, it's hideously expensive for most things. It can go up to $20,000 a hectare plus. And so certainly is an option, certainly needs some serious thought about what do you want in that patch and is it something you want to get going? So it makes the conifer management in the first place look cheap. So I guess next steps really in terms of the science and the management, and we are wrapping up, we must be close to, oh, good. Wow, that's a surprise. I could keep going. So I mentioned we've got this reinvasion program. One of the things with turning off the tap or going from 33 million to 10 million means there's a lot less management going on. And unfortunately, one of the consequences of that is either less management or less frequently going back to places to do a wilding control, which means this reinvasion, this idea of things coming back in, really is going to be a big issue in the next couple of years. So there is an MB program a lot of us are involved with, which is trying to say, can we do some, can we understand where invasion is a big problem? And then what can you do about it? And some of the things that we can chat more, but one of them is Ian Dickey working on a native fungi as a potential biocontrol. It loves dead wood. You control conifers, you have dead wood. You can inoculate it and it's selective against pines. So it looks like a dampening sort of disease of seedlings. Maybe that'll work. Briefly mentioned the national program, this partnership. It certainly is a difficult position to be in, having a funding drop. Aside from the employment issues, it's how do we actually go about funding further wilding control? And so again, the science is only a little part of those sort of decisions, but the idea of walking away from places is not going to sit well with landowners and lots of government departments. So a lot of what we're doing now is, what are the key messages? How do we go back and sustain some of these efforts? And if anybody has deep pockets, please let me know. I can match you up. I guess the last one, and what really hasn't been done well, but it's sort of a sitter now, is, okay, what happens post-fire, post-storms, all these sorts of events we're well aware of, because there is sort of windows of opportunity for either doing restoration or managing invasions. And that's certainly the case with weeds. We can think about cyclone damage and recovery, for example. So some of these things are being planned, but they're not quite hit the ground yet. I think that might be, so what's next? Lots. Certainly less conifers currently, but they're not, we haven't won against them yet. We haven't fixed the problem, but we made serious progress both in the science and the management. And I will back up and leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Duane. Do we have any questions? Yeah. Yeah, hey, I was wondering about if with the conifers, when you kill them, I think I asked Kara about this the other day, but does that acidify the soil with all of the needles and all the dead wood dropping? So that, I guess that might be one of the problems with the reestablishment of native species. If that is acidified, at least temporarily, that might make, even if there is higher phosphates or whatever else he said, that might make it unavailable for the native trees or whatever is trying to move in there. Is that something that I'm sure you guys have looked at this, but I was just wondering if you could talk about that.
How much time do you have? Couple of things. This particular slide that we point out, case in point. So now this was a few years ago. That would have been 100% canopy cover within 2 years, and then boom sprayed. And so basically you've gone from nothing in the understory, literally there's one or two species that hang in the gaps, to now you've got standing wood with litter. So if we took this picture now, you just see a completely brown swath of terrace. So a couple of things happen. Litter falls, and certainly acid, you drop a couple of pH, no question. One of the weird things is there's actually quite a lot of phosphorus in the soil, but it's not available. So I do this because why do people drop superphosphate on? It's because it's actually one of the major limiting things, especially in the high country. And so you've actually almost top dressed this thing. So the first thing that comes in is brown top and a lot of the exotic grasses. So great if you want pasture, and that's actually what's done. This is Clarence River, Molesworth Station, this shot. But you basically got nothing in terms of natives persisting at that site. So it's got to reinvade, or it's got to come from the edges. It doesn't regenerate within. The only thing is, yeah, some of the native tussocks can persist in the understory if it's not 100% cover. Yeah. The other side of it is the pines love it in terms of coming in. So again, the management money now is up to the river, huge effort. The money runs out. Everything to the left of that scene towards Hemner Springs is not going to be managed anytime soon. So guess where the next seed rain's coming from. So it's a little bit of a, but you know, at least you set a line, you try to maintain that, and then hope in the next 2 years to be able to push further. Yeah.
Thinking about the drones and the artificial intelligence and individually spraying the trees, there's some massive leap forward in the horticultural weeding space with the robots. What do you see the potential here is?
Yeah, huge. So not my area, I'll admit. So again, this is one of those sort of partnerships. Originally, it was, can we use drones to map where the conifers are at sites? Because often they're sparse, and a lot of the effort is even just knowing how many are there, how big are they, planning operations. So I think the latest is it's actually partway down where there's basically a mapping, and then there's a set of drones that go in, but it's a swarm. It's not individual drones doing the thing. And so for places, the flats are fine, but it's when you get into the horrible, rocky, difficult to reach bits that are sparse, that's where you can kind of see it's difficult to put ground crews in. The technology is basically getting there. And you're right, a lot of the horticulture industry, the sort of automated detection and control of weeds, you've got a combination of the hardware with the drones coming down in price, and heavy lift has been one of those issues, is that there's larger drones that can actually carry herbicide. That's been one of the limitations. And I think that's slowly getting overcome. Same with predator free, right? So some of the remote access and being able to use heavy lift drones, the technology is there. It's all about the regulation that you need line of sight still. So I think these things are going to, you know, potentially really accelerate in the next few years once those barriers are overcome. Yeah.
In regards to burning, what sort of trials or headway are they making there?
Oh, fire.
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't mention fire. Long story short is it's difficult to do trials, but private land, I'll give you a mixed thing. It's one of those things, it's a year-on thing where can't we just use fire as a control tool? And of course, the health and safety, the paperwork involves drives you mad. Mackenzie Basin was certainly considered for fire as a tool, and those accidental ones are sort of, okay, here's what would happen if you know, accidental, we can do a better job if it's managed, but it would take at least 2 to 3 years to get the paperwork in order, and then it's a high visibility site and so forth. So they've never really been done except on farms. If you're private land, you can burn and so on. And there's certainly people who have trialed and shown that you can control areas, and usually it's for pasture. So you're doing your fire, but you follow it up with other things. So it's not just getting rid of the pines. The thing is, it's not cheap. That's one of the things is, hey, isn't this cheap control safer? But not when you actually include all the health and safety and things you need around it. It's not cheap. And accidental fires are certainly expensive, like the Flock Hill one. Many of you may know, something like 600,000 or 700,000 just to, and it put itself out. That was just the standby and the staff and the helicopters and so forth. So it's certainly being considered, but it's not really used in practice except on private land. Yeah.
I'm just a bit curious, given that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, and if we could have done this 10 years or 15 years ago, what the practicability and cost difference would have been. Is there's much going on around the research of trying to move that public awareness or that support over to the left side of that curve?
Yeah, it's a good question. So yes. So really lean on Pike Brown here. Many of you may know him from those colony loss surveys. He's the survey of rural decision makers. We always snuck wilding questions in there. That's where those awareness maps came out. But it was actually, there was follow-up surveys, and it was basically both the surveys and some sort of models linking social ecological systems said a little bit of early education and a little bit of behavior change is gold. So basically 2 scenarios. One is you don't bother, you don't care about people, you just roll out the management. You will achieve your goals, but it takes longer. It's much more expensive than if you do a little bit of education and we'll call it behavior change, or a few more people on site early, means you get there faster and cheaper. And that isn't just a Wildings thing. That is certainly with any biosecurity. One thing we're trying to do is leapfrog other countries. So I haven't really mentioned any of the international, but certainly Chile, Argentina, Iceland is the latest one, have active reef plantations still of contorta, which is the one most people here focus on. And they kind of look at New Zealand as let's avoid that. How do we do it? And so they're at the stage of just trying to stop the first plantings of them and say, this is an issue. If we do something now, it's better. Look what happens if we don't. Some decades we've got places in New Zealand. So we're using this as a way to try to help others. Yeah.